It was just another ordinary evening at home. My son, Caleb, was upstairs finishing his homework, while my wife, Lauren, and I sat at the dinner table. She and I had been together for 6 years, but at that moment, it felt like we were worlds apart. The silence between us was deafening. She barely touched her food, idly pushing it around with her fork, lost in her own thoughts. At first, I assumed she was just exhausted from a long day, but the way she avoided making eye contact told me otherwise. Something was off. Finally, I broke the silence. "Is everything okay?" She stopped moving her fork and looked up at me. In that moment, everything changed. "I think we should try an open marriage," she said. For a brief second, I thought I had misheard her. My mind scrambled to process the words, but her expression remained steady. There was no hesitation, no nervous laughter, just certainty. She leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and continued. "I think having more freedom, exploring other options, it could make our relationship stronger." Stronger. My thoughts were in chaos, yet everything around me seemed to slow down. There was no guilt in her voice, no sign that she was testing the waters to gauge my reaction. She had already made up her mind, and that terrified me more than anything. I could have lost my temper, could have demanded to know if someone else was already in the picture, if I was just a placeholder. But instead, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay composed. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "That's not the marriage I agreed to." I met her gaze, unwavering. "If you're done with this, just say it." She didn't flinch. She didn't even hesitate. Instead, she simply shrugged. "I figured you'd say that." Then, without another word, she stood up, grabbed her plate, and walked away. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a conversation. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was a decision she had already made. She wasn't looking for my input. She was merely informing me of what was about to happen. Later, I learned exactly where this was coming from. Lauren had a friend who convinced her husband to open their marriage while still enjoying the stability, financial security, and home he provided. She had been watching, imagining herself in that same situation, wanting the best of both worlds. She craved the security I gave her while seeking excitement elsewhere. And the worst part? She genuinely thought I'd be okay with it. The next morning, the house was eerily silent. No good morning from Lauren, just an empty, detached stillness. When I walked into the kitchen, she was sitting at the table, coffee in hand, scrolling through her phone as if I didn't exist. I stood there for a moment, waiting for some form of acknowledgement, a glance, a nod, anything. But nothing came. Normally, we'd exchange a quick "have a good day" before heading off to work, but not today. When I finally broke the silence and said, "Morning," she didn't even look up. She just took a sip of her coffee and continued scrolling. At work, I checked my phone countless times, hoping for a message. A casual text. An update. Anything. But my screen remained blank. No "how's your day going?" No check-ins. It was as if I no longer existed in her world. That night at dinner, the space between us felt like an invisible wall. I tried making conversation, but her responses were short and lifeless. "MHM. Okay. Yeah." That was all I got. The woman I had spent 6 years with now treated me like a stranger. And the worst part? She didn't even seem to care. As the days passed, her coldness turned into something far worse, blatant disrespect. She stopped pretending altogether. If she wasn't ignoring me, she was making it clear that she had already moved on. I'd sit beside her on the couch, and she'd be glued to her phone, smiling like a love-struck teenager. I saw the spark in her eyes, the way her fingers moved rapidly over the screen, completely absorbed in a conversation that had nothing to do with me. And that was when I knew, whatever we had built together, it was already gone. I asked, "Who are you talking to?" She let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes. "No one. No one." Really? Lately, she had been going out more frequently, dressing like a woman without commitments. She started wearing elegant outfits, spending extra time perfecting her hair and makeup. Whenever I asked where she was headed, her answers were vague at best. "Just out with friends," she'd say, slipping on her heels. If I pressed for details, she'd just grab her purse and dismiss me with a sharp, "Why do you care?" before slamming the door on her way out. Some nights, she didn't bother coming home at all. No text, no call, no explanation. Then, the following morning, she'd walk in as if nothing had happened, head straight to the bathroom, and crawl into bed without a single word. I could smell the alcohol on her, but I kept my mouth shut. I knew that if I said anything, she'd just scoff, call me paranoid, and roll her eyes. One night, after weeks of silence and cold shoulders, I had enough. When she walked through the door, I stood in the hallway, arms crossed. "Lauren, we need to talk." She barely glanced at me before smirking. Then she laughed. "No, we don't." With that, she brushed past me and shut the bedroom door in my face. That was when I realized this wasn't just neglect. It was intentional. She wanted me to feel invisible. It's painful enough when your wife stops caring about you. But when your child starts noticing it too, it cuts even deeper. One evening, as I cleared the dinner table, Caleb looked up at me with his big, innocent eyes and asked, "Dad, why doesn't Lauren eat with us anymore?" For a moment, I was at a loss for words. How do you explain to an 11-year-old that the woman he sees as family doesn't even want to sit at the same table anymore? That she was choosing to shut us out? I forced a smile, ruffling his hair. "She's just been busy, buddy." He nodded, accepting my answer, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He probably knew I wasn't being honest. That night, after Caleb went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the wall. I felt like a ghost in my own home, fading away while Lauren didn't even pretend to care anymore. I had reached my limit. It was around 2 a.m. when I was startled awake by the sound of quiet laughter. At first, I was groggy, still trapped in the haze of sleep. But as I blinked in the darkness, my eyes adjusted. There she was, Lauren, lying beside me, her phone screen casting a soft glow on her face. She was smiling, completely absorbed in a conversation, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. She was texting someone, and whoever it was, they were making her laugh. She didn't even realize I was awake. Or maybe she did, but just didn't care. Something inside me snapped. Up until that moment, I had been making excuses, convincing myself that this was just a rough patch. But watching her lie in our bed, smiling at another man through a screen, made one thing painfully clear. She wasn't coming back. Worse, she thought I would just sit there and tolerate it. Not anymore. The next morning, while she was still asleep, I made a decision. I wasn't just leaving, I was leaving with purpose. From that moment on, I started documenting everything. Every unexplained night out. Every time she brushed off my questions with an icy "Why do you care?" Every act of disrespect. Then I got my chance. Lauren left her phone unattended for a few minutes. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, opened her messages, and took screenshots of every conversation she had with the men she was entertaining. Then I sent them to myself. I needed proof, because I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story when I walked away. The next step was legal. I reached out to a lawyer, determined to understand my rights and ensure that when I left, she would have no control over me anymore. Then I went to my boss. I had been considering a job transfer to another state for a while, but I had always held back because of Lauren. Now, there was nothing keeping me here. My boss approved it almost immediately. The last piece of the puzzle was finding an apartment in the city. I wasn't just planning an escape. I was setting myself up for a future where I didn't have to be a bystander in my own life anymore. Everything was falling into place. A fresh start was finally within reach. All I had to do was wait for the right moment. Leaving wasn't something I could do impulsively. I had to be strategic, observant, and patient. And the more I watched, the clearer my decision became. Lauren had completely abandoned any pretense. She wasn't even trying to hide her indifference anymore. She came and went as she pleased, barely acknowledging my presence, let alone Caleb's. Even though she wasn't his biological mother, the way she ignored him made it seem like he didn't exist at all. She was so consumed with chasing the life she believed she deserved that she didn't care about the boy living under her roof. That was the moment I knew it was time to go. That morning, Lauren probably slept in, just as she had been doing for weeks. She had settled into a routine of lounging around, taking her time getting out of bed, knowing there was no real urgency in her life. At first, she might not have noticed anything different. But as she wandered through the house, the silence would start to feel unusual. Little details would begin to stand out. The final clue would hit her when she stepped into the kitchen for her usual morning cup of coffee. There, on the counter, right beside the coffee maker, was an envelope. I had placed it there deliberately, knowing it would be the first thing she reached for. Inside, she'd find the divorce papers. Sitting on top was a small sticky note with a simple message written in my handwriting. I hope you find the freedom you wanted. I could only imagine her reaction. Maybe shock, maybe anger, or maybe nothing at all. But the truth was, I no longer cared. And that was the most freeing realization of all. I didn't care anymore. After I left, Lauren made no effort to reach out. Not once. There were no calls, no messages, no pretense of regret or second thoughts. If there was even a sliver of her that missed me or the life we had built together, it wasn't enough for her to pick up the phone. She simply didn't care. The only time I finally heard from her was through a lawyer. No personal message. No attempt at closure. Just a formal legal demand with her name stamped at the bottom. And what was she after? Money. She wasn't concerned with how I was doing. She had no interest in fixing things. She just wanted a payout. Lauren didn't even try to fight for Caleb. He had never been hers to begin with. And deep down, I knew she had never truly embraced the role of a mother. When I walked away, she didn't pretend to want custody. What she did want was my bank account. Her lawyer's letter laid out her demands like a shopping list. A lump sum for the years we had been married. Alimony, despite being fully capable of working. And the most absurd demand of all, half of everything I owned. She genuinely believed that after everything she had done, I would still be obligated to fund her lifestyle. The audacity would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic. She wasn't asking for what was fair. She was demanding a reward for treating me like I didn't matter. But I had already made my choice. And no amount of greed, entitlement, or selfishness would ever make me regret walking away. I had no intention of entertaining her demands. When I stepped into that courtroom, I already knew how it would play out. I had spent months gathering every shred of evidence necessary to ensure she wouldn't walk away with a dime. I had documented everything. Her late nights, her indifference, her blatant disrespect. I even had screenshots of her messages with other men, proving this wasn't just emotional detachment. She had moved on long before she ever floated the idea of an open marriage. When my lawyer presented the case, it wasn't even a competition. The judge barely needed to deliberate. One look at the evidence, and the decision was made. Everything ruled in my favor. Lauren walked away with nothing. For so long, she had treated me like I was disposable, convinced that either I would endure her selfishness or that, even if I left, I'd still be financially tied to her. But she had gambled and lost. She had no one to blame but herself. It had been over 2 years since Caleb and I walked away, 2 years since we left that house and the past behind. In all that time, Lauren never once reached out. And I was perfectly fine with that. I had moved forward. I wouldn't say I was completely healed, but I was in a better place. I wasn't waiting for an apology or some last-minute revelation from her. I had accepted long ago that closure wasn't something I needed. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang. I was in the middle of making dinner when I saw the name flash across my screen. Lauren. For a moment, I just stared at it. I didn't even realize I still had her number saved. My fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating. What could she possibly want now? Deep down, I already knew. People like Lauren only reach out when they need something. Finally, I answered. George. Her voice was different. Gone was the arrogance, the dismissiveness. In its place was something unfamiliar, hesitation. I stayed silent, waiting. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. I could hear the way her breath hitched, like she wasn't sure if I would listen or hang up. I was selfish, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought you'd always be there. I never thought you'd actually leave. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. There it was. The realization had finally hit her. But it was far too late. After a long pause, she finally spoke the words I had been expecting. I miss you. And yet, I felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just nothing. I exhaled slowly and responded in a steady, even tone. Do you miss me? Or do you miss the fact that I loved you even when you didn't deserve it? The silence on the other end was deafening. She tried again, her voice breaking. George, please. But I had already made up my mind. I wasn't that man anymore. Not the one who waited. Not the one who hoped. Not the one who allowed himself to be treated like an afterthought in his own marriage. Lauren, I hope you heal, but I'm not coming back. And with that, I ended the call. For the first time in years, I felt truly free.